Imagine this. You're sitting in a quiet courtroom, the air thick with tension. The kind of tension that makes your stomach twist because you know something big is about to go down. On one side of the room, there's a judge, calm, composed, and commanding respect. On the other side, there's a woman who's about to make the biggest mistake of her life. This isn't just any woman, though. This is that woman. The one who's used to getting her way. The one who thinks the rules don't apply to her. You know the type. The kind of person who will argue with a cashier over a 10-cent coupon or call the cops because someone parked half an inch over the line. Yeah, that's her. And today she's about to learn a lesson she'll never forget. Let's rewind a bit. This story starts in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with perfectly manicured lawns and houses that all look the same. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. And at the center of it all is the HOA, the Homeowners Association. Now, if you've ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, you know they can be intense. They're the ones who tell you what color you can paint your front door, how tall your grass can be, and whether or not you can have a garden gnome in your yard. And leading the charge in this particular HOA is Karen. Yes, that Karen. The one who's always got something to say, always has a complaint, and always seems to be in everyone's business. She's the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, and she rules with an iron fist. But here's the thing about Karen. She's never been challenged. Not really. Sure, people grumble behind her back, but no one's ever stood up to her. Until now. Because Karen's about to meet her match. And it all starts with a simple dispute. A neighbor, let's call him Marcus, has been having some issues with the HOA. Nothing major, just a few disagreements about some repairs he's been trying to make to his house. But Karen, being Karen, decides to make it her personal mission to shut him down. She's sending letters, calling meetings, and even threatening fines. Marcus tries to reason with her, but it's no use. Karen's not interested in reason. She's interested in control. So Marcus does the only thing he can think of. He takes the HOA to court. And that's where things get interesting. Because the judge assigned to the case, she's not just any judge. She's Judge Williams, a highly respected, no-nonsense black woman who's known for her fairness and her zero tolerance for disrespect. When Karen walks into that courtroom, she's confident. Too confident. She's used to getting her way, and she doesn't think this will be any different. But Judge Williams? She's not having it. From the moment Karen opens her mouth, it's clear she's in over her head. She's dismissive, she's rude, and she's downright disrespectful. And Judge Williams? She's not about to let that slide. What happens next is a showdown for the ages. Karen, with her sense of entitlement and complete lack of self-awareness, goes head-to-head with Judge Williams, who's not about to let anyone, no matter how loud or obnoxious, disrespect her courtroom. The tension is palpable. Every word, every glance, every moment feels like it's building to something explosive. And just when you think it can't get any more intense, Karen crosses a line she can't come back from. And that's when everything changes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because this story isn't just about a courtroom showdown. It's about power, privilege, and what happens when someone who's used to having both gets a reality check. It's about standing up for yourself, even when the odds are stacked against you. And it's about justice. Real justice, not the kind that comes from a rule book or a gavel, but the kind that comes from holding people accountable for their actions. So what happens next? Well, let's just say Karen's about to learn a lesson she'll never forget. But to find out how it all goes down, you'll have to keep watching. Because this is just the beginning. To understand how Karen ended up in that courtroom facing off against Judge Williams, we need to go back a few months. Back to when the cracks in her carefully constructed world of control first started to show. It all began with Marcus, a quiet, hard-working guy who'd moved into the neighborhood about a year ago. Marcus wasn't the type to cause trouble. He kept to himself, worked long hours, and spent his weekends fixing up his house. He was the kind of neighbor most people would be happy to have. Friendly, but not nosy. Responsible, but not overbearing. But to Karen, Marcus was a problem. Not because of anything he did, but because of what he represented. Marcus was different. And in Karen's world, Different was dangerous. It started small. A notice from the HOA about his trash cans being left out too long. Then another about the height of his grass. Then another about the color of his shutters. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. He fixed the issues, paid the fines, and moved on. But the notices kept coming, and they were getting more ridiculous. One day, Karen showed up at his door, clipboard in hand, to inform him that his mailbox was not in compliance with neighborhood standards. Marcus tried to reason with her. He explained that he'd bought the mailbox from the same store as everyone else, and it was the same model as the one across the street. But Karen wasn't interested in reason. She had a rule book, and she was determined to enforce it, no matter how petty or absurd the rules seemed. Marcus wasn't the only one who'd had run-ins with Karen. Over the years, she'd made life difficult for just about everyone in the HOA neighborhood. There was the single mom who got fined for having a too colorful garden. The elderly couple who were told they couldn't park their RV in their own driveway. Even the guy who got a warning for having a bird feeder that was attracting too many birds. People grumbled, but no one did anything. Karen had a way of making herself untouchable. She was the HOA president, after all, and she had the board wrapped around her finger. If you crossed her, you'd find yourself buried in fines, red tape, and endless meetings. So most people just kept their heads down and tried to stay out of her way. But Marcus wasn't most people. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where standing up for yourself wasn't just a choice. It was a necessity. He'd seen what happened when people let bullies like Karen have their way, and he wasn't about to let that happen here. So, he started pushing back. He attended HOA meetings, asked questions, and demanded answers. And Karen? She didn't like that one bit. She was used to being in control, to having the final say. Marcus's defiance was a threat to her authority, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Things came to a head one summer evening at the monthly HOA meeting. Marcus showed up, armed with a list of grievances and a determination to be heard. Karen, of course, was ready for him. She had her usual posse of board members, all nodding along as she dismissed his concerns one by one. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the rules, the unfairness of the fines, and the blatant favoritism that seemed to dictate every decision. For the first time, people started to listen. They started to ask questions. And Karen? She didn't like that one bit. The meeting ended in chaos. Karen tried to shut Marcus down, but he kept pushing. Other neighbors started speaking up, sharing their own frustrations. By the time it was over, the room was buzzing with tension. Karen stormed out, her face red with anger. But Marcus? He felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, he thought maybe, just maybe, things could change. But Karen wasn't about to let that happen. The next day, Marcus woke up to a notice on his door. It was a cease and desist letter from the HOA, threatening legal action if he continued to disrupt their meetings. Marcus was stunned. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd just spoken his mind. But Karen was playing hardball, and she wasn't about to let him win. That's when Marcus decided to take things to the next level. He reached out to a lawyer who advised him to file a formal complaint against the HOA. It wasn't an easy decision. Marcus knew it would mean going up against Karen, and he knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. But he also knew he couldn't let her keep bullying him, or anyone else in the neighborhood. So, he took a deep breath, signed the papers, and prepared for the battle ahead. The case was assigned to Judge Williams, a respected figure in the local legal community. She was known for her fairness, her no-nonsense attitude, and her commitment to justice. When Marcus heard she'd be presiding over the case, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he'd finally get a fair shake. But Karen? She wasn't worried. She was used to getting her way, and she didn't think this would be any different. She showed up to court that day with her head held high, ready to defend her actions and put Marcus in his place. What she didn't realize was that Judge Williams wasn't like the people she was used to dealing with. Judge Williams didn't care about Karen's title, her connections, or her sense of entitlement. She cared about the law, and she wasn't about to let anyone, no matter how loud or obnoxious, disrespect her courtroom. The tension in the room was palpable as the hearing began. Karen, with her usual air of superiority, tried to take control. She interrupted Marcus, talked over the judge, and even rolled her eyes at one point. But Judge Williams wasn't having. Now she shut Karen down with a sharp look and a few well-chosen words, and that's when things started to unravel. As the hearing went on, it became clear that Karen was in over her head. She stumbled over her words, contradicted herself, and even admitted to breaking a few of the very rules she claimed to enforce. Marcus, on the other hand, was calm, collected, and respectful. He presented his case clearly and confidently, and it was obvious that Judge Williams was listening. But just when it seemed like things might finally go Marcus's way, Karen crossed a line. She made a comment, a dismissive, disrespectful comment that stopped the room cold. Judge Williams froze, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face Karen. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next, and that's where we'll leave it for now. Because what happens next? Well, let's just say it's going to change everything. For Karen, for Marcus, and for the entire neighborhood. But to find out how it all goes down, you'll have to keep watching. Because this story? It's far from over. The moment Karen's disrespectful comment hung in the air, the courtroom seemed to freeze. Judge Williams, usually unshakable, leaned forward in her chair, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice low but carrying a weight that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Karen, for the first time, looked unsure. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The confidence she'd walked in with was starting to crack, and it was clear she hadn't expected this kind of pushback. Marcus, sitting a few feet away, felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, but also a strange sense of relief. Finally, someone was holding Karen accountable. But this wasn't just about Karen and Marcus anymore. The courtroom was packed with neighbors who'd come to watch the drama unfold. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of solidarity with Marcus. A few even hoped this case might finally bring an end to Karen's reign of terror. The Mongai. Then was Linda, a retired teacher who'd been quietly documenting Karen's behavior for years. She'd seen the way Karen targeted certain neighbors, the way she twisted the rules to suit her agenda. Linda had tried to speak up before, but no one had listened. Now, sitting in that courtroom, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time, things would be different. Then there was Tom, the HOA treasurer, who'd always been one of Karen's staunchest supporters. But lately, even he'd started to have doubts. He'd seen the way Karen's actions were dividing the neighborhood, the way her obsession with control was driving people away. He'd tried to talk to her about it, but she'd brushed him off, accusing him of being disloyal. Now, watching her unravel in front of the judge, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd been on the wrong side all along. As the hearing continued, more details came to light. Marcus's lawyer presented evidence of the HOA's selective enforcement of the rules, photos of identical violations that had been ignored when committed by Karen's friends, but punished harshly when committed by others. He showed emails and letters from neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak up publicly, detailing the harassment and intimidation they'd faced at Karen's hands. And then there was the financial angle. The lawyer raised questions about the HOA's budget, pointing out discrepancies that suggested funds might have been mismanaged, or worse. Karen, of course, denied everything. She tried to deflect, to shift the blame onto Marcus and his disruptive behavior. But her arguments were weak and her tone was defensive. It was clear she was losing control and she didn't like it one bit. Judge Williams, meanwhile, was taking it all in. She asked pointed questions, demanded clear answers, and didn't let anyone off the hook. It was obvious she wasn't just going through the motions. She was determined to get to the truth. Outside the courtroom, the neighborhood was buzzing. News of the hearing had spread quickly, and everyone had an opinion. Some people were firmly on Marcus's side, cheering him on for standing up to Karen. Others were more cautious, worried about what this might mean for the neighborhood. And then there were those who were still loyal to Karen, convinced she was being unfairly targeted. The divide was deepening, and it was starting to feel like the neighborhood was on the brink of something big. Back in the courtroom, things were heating up. Marcus's lawyer called Linda to the stand. She testified about the years of intimidation she'd witnessed, the way Karen had used her position to silence anyone who dared to question her. Then, Tom was called up, and his testimony was even more damning. He admitted that he'd had concerns about the HOA's finances but had been too afraid to speak up. He talked about the pressure Karen had put on him to keep quiet, the threats she'd made when he tried to push back. It was a bombshell moment, and the room erupted in murmurs. Karen, meanwhile, was visibly shaken. She tried to object, to interrupt, but Judge Williams wasn't having it. "You'll have your turn to speak," she said firmly, "but right now, you'll sit quietly and listen." Karen sank back into her seat, her face pale. For the first time, it seemed to dawn on her that she might not win this fight, but just when it seemed like the case might be wrapping up, a new twist emerged. Marcus's lawyer introduced a piece of evidence that no one had seen coming, a recording. It was a conversation between Karen and another board member, discussing how to handle Marcus and make sure he learned his place. The tone was cold, calculating, and it sent a chill through the room. Karen's lawyer objected, of course, but Judge Williams allowed it to be played. As the recording ended, the room was silent. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, and that's where we'll leave it for now. Because what happens next? Well, let's just say it's going to change everything. For Karen, for Marcus, for the neighborhood, and maybe even for Judge Williams. But to find out how it all goes down, you'll have to keep watching, because this story, it's far from over. The stakes are higher than ever, and the tension is only building. What will Karen do next? How will Marcus respond? And what role will the rest of the neighborhood play in all of this? Stick around, because the drama is just getting started. The recording echoed through the courtroom, its words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Karen's voice, cold and calculating, laid bare her intentions to handle Marcus and make sure he learned his place. The room was dead silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had stopped. Everyone was staring at Karen, waiting for her reaction. She sat stiffly in her chair, her face a mask of shock and anger. For a moment it looked like she might explode, but then she clenched her jaw and stayed silent. Judge Williams, meanwhile, was unreadable. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled, as if processing what she'd just heard. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Marcus, sitting a few feet away, felt a surge of emotions. Relief, anger, vindication. It all swirled together as he realized just how far Karen had been willing to go to silence him. He glanced around the room and caught the eyes of a few neighbors. Some looked shocked, others furious. Linda, the retired teacher, gave him a small nod of encouragement. Tom, the HOA treasurer, looked like he was about to be sick. It was clear that this wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This was about everyone who'd ever been pushed around by Karen, everyone who'd ever been too afraid to speak up. The stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. Judge Williams finally broke the silence. "Ms. Karen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "do you have anything to say about this recording?" Karen's lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting, loudly, but the judge held up a hand to silence him. "I'm asking your client," she said, her eyes never leaving Karen. Karen hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she had to say something, but what? Deny it? Blame someone else? Or maybe, just maybe, admit the truth? For the first time in her life, Karen felt truly cornered, and she didn't like it one bit. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the neighborhood was in chaos. News of the recording had spread like wildfire, and people were gathering in small groups, whispering furiously. Some were outraged, demanding that Karen step down immediately. Others were more cautious, worried about what this might mean for the future of the HOA. And then there were those who still supported Karen, convinced that the recording had been taken out of context or even faked. The divide in the neighborhood was growing deeper by the minute, and it was starting to feel like things were spiraling out of control. Back inside the courtroom, Karen finally found her voice. "That recording is fake," she said, her tone defiant but shaky. "I never said those things. Someone is trying to frame me." Marcus's lawyer didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor," he said, "we have evidence that this recording is authentic. We're happy to provide it for review." Judge Williams nodded, her expression unreadable. "We'll take a short recess to review the evidence," she said. "Court will resume in 30 minutes. And with that, she stood and left the room, leaving everyone else to process what had just happened. The recess felt like an eternity. Marcus sat with his lawyer, going over their next steps. Linda and a few other neighbors came over to offer their support, their voices low but determined. Karen, meanwhile, huddled with her lawyer, their heads close together as they whispered furiously. The tension in the room was palpable, and it was clear that everyone was on edge. When Judge Williams finally returned, the room fell silent again. She took her seat, her expression as unreadable as ever, and looked out at the room. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, "I find the recording to be authentic. We will proceed." Karen's face went pale. She opened her mouth to protest, but her lawyer quickly silenced her with a sharp look. It was clear that things were not going her way, and she was starting to realize just how much trouble she was in. Marcus, on the other hand, felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it felt like justice might actually be within reach. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and he had a feeling she still had a few tricks up her sleeve. As the hearing resumed, Marcus's lawyer called another witness to the stand, a former HOA board member who'd resigned under mysterious circumstances. Her testimony was explosive. She talked about the pressure Karen had put on her to vote a certain way, the threats she'd made when she didn't comply, and the way she'd manipulated the rules to suit her own agenda. It was clear that Karen's control over the HOA had been absolute, and that she'd been willing to do whatever it took to maintain it. Karen's lawyer tried to discredit the witness, but it was no use. The damage had been done, and then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, Marcus's lawyer dropped another bombshell. He presented evidence that Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, luxury vacations, expensive dinners, even a new car. The room erupted in gasps. Karen's lawyer objected, of course, but Judge Williams allowed the evidence to be presented. It was clear that this case was about more than just a dispute over a mailbox or a trash can. This was about corruption, abuse of power, and the lengths one person would go to maintain control. By the time the hearing ended for the day, the tension in the room was at an all-time high. Karen looked like she'd been hit by a truck, her usual confidence shattered. Marcus, meanwhile, felt a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a strange sense of hope. But he knew better than to let his guard down. Karen wasn't done yet, and he had a feeling the worst was still to come. As people filed out of the courtroom, the buzz of conversation was deafening. Everyone was talking about what had happened, speculating about what would come next. Some were already calling for Karen to resign, while others were worried about what this might mean for the neighborhood. One thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again, and that's where we'll leave it for now. Because what happens next? Well, let's just say it's going to be explosive. The stakes are higher than ever, the tension is at its peak, and the outcome is anything but certain. Will Karen finally face the consequences of her actions? Will Marcus get the justice he's been fighting for? And what will this mean for the neighborhood as a whole? Stick around, because the climax of this story is going to be one you won't want to miss. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of the day's revelations hung heavy in the air. Karen sat slumped in her chair, her usual air of superiority replaced by a hollow, shell-shocked expression. Her lawyer was frantically flipping through papers, muttering under his breath about damage control. Marcus, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. He'd come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. But as he stepped out into the hallway, he was met with a sight that stopped him in his tracks. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, reporters, even a few curious onlookers who'd heard about the case. Cameras flashed and microphones were shoved in his face. Marcus, how does it feel to finally expose Karen?" one reporter shouted. "Do you think this will change the neighborhood for good?" another asked. Marcus held up a hand, trying to shield his face from the barrage of questions. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and it was overwhelming. But before he could say anything, Linda stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Give him some space," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The reporters backed off, but the buzz of excitement didn't die down. It was clear that this case had become bigger than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, Karen was slipping out a side exit, her lawyer close behind. She avoided eye contact with anyone, her face pale and drawn. But as she reached her car, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted from shock to something else, something darker. She quickly typed out a reply, her fingers trembling slightly before shoving the phone back into her purse. Whatever that message was, it was clear that Karen wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with even more rumors. Overnight, flyers had appeared on doors and mailboxes accusing Marcus of being a troublemaker who was trying to destroy the community. The language was inflammatory, and it was clear that someone was trying to turn the tide of public opinion. Marcus woke up to a flood of texts from neighbors, some supportive, others questioning his motives. He felt a knot of frustration tighten in his chest. He'd been so close to exposing Karen, and now it felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. But the real bombshell came later that day. Just as the hearing was about to resume, a new piece of evidence was submitted to the court, a video. It was security footage from the night before, showing someone sneaking around Marcus's house. The figure was hooded, their face obscured, but they were clearly up to no good. The video cut out before anything happened, but the implication was clear. Someone was trying to intimidate Marcus, or worse. Judge Williams watched the footage with a steely expression. "This is a serious matter," she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "If anyone in this courtroom is involved in these actions, I suggest they come forward now." The room was silent, but the tension was palpable. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming the video was irrelevant. But Judge Williams wasn't having. "Dorson, this case is about more than just HOA violations," she said. "It's about intimidation, harassment, and abuse of power, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." As the hearing continued, Marcus's lawyer presented more evidence, emails, text messages, even financial records, that painted a damning picture of Karen's actions. But just when it seemed like the case was wrapping up, Karen's lawyer dropped a bombshell of his own. He called a surprise witness to the stand, a former neighbor of Marcus's who claimed that Marcus had a history of causing trouble and stirring up drama. The testimony was vague and unsubstantiated, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd never even met this person before, and yet here they were, trying to discredit him. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Williams had to call for order. "This is a serious allegation," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Do you have any evidence to support this claim?" Karen's lawyer hesitated, then admitted that they didn't, at least not yet. But the damage had been done. The tension in the room was thicker than ever, and it was clear that this case was far from over. As the hearing adjourned for the day, Marcus felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and a growing sense of unease. He knew Karen was desperate, but he hadn't expected her to go this far. And then there was the video. Who had been sneaking around his house? Was it Karen? One of her supporters? Or was it someone else entirely? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no answers. Outside the courtroom, the neighborhood was more divided than ever. Some people were firmly on Marcus's side, convinced that Karen was behind the intimidation tactics. Others were starting to doubt, swayed by the smear campaign against him. And then there were those who just wanted the drama to be over no matter what it took. The tension was palpable, and it felt like the neighborhood was on the brink of something explosive. And that's where we'll leave it for now. Because what happens next? Well, let's just say it's going to be even bigger than anyone expected. The stakes are higher than ever. The tension is at its peak, and the outcome is anything but certain. Will Marcus be able to prove his innocence? Will Karen's desperate tactics backfire? And what about the mysterious figure in the video? Stick around because this story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. The climax is just around the corner, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. The final day of the hearing arrived and the courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls, craning their necks to see. The tension was electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. Marcus sat at his table, his hands clenched into fists trying to steady his nerves. Karen across the room looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her usual polished appearance was gone, replaced by a frazzled, almost wild look. Even her lawyer seemed on edge, constantly glancing at his watch and shuffling papers. It was clear that this was it, the moment everything would come to a head. Judge Williams entered the room and everyone fell silent. She took her seat, her expression as unreadable as ever, and called the court to order. "We've heard a lot of testimony over the past few days," she began, her voice calm but firm. "And it's clear that this case is about more than just a dispute between neighbors. It's about power, accountability, and the lengths some people will go to maintain control." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Today we will hear closing arguments and reach a decision. But before we do, there's one more piece of evidence to present." Marcus's lawyer stood holding up a USB drive. "Your Honor, we've obtained additional footage from the night in question," he said. "This video clearly shows the identity of the person who was sneaking around my client's property." Karen's lawyer objected immediately, but Judge Williams overruled him. "Let's see it," she said. The room held its breath as the video played on the courtroom screen. At first it was just a shadowy figure, hood pulled low, moving cautiously around Marcus's house. But then as the figure turned, the hood slipped, and the face was unmistakable. It was Tom, the HOA treasurer. The room erupted in gasps. Tom, who had testified against Karen just days ago, was the one trying to intimidate Marcus. The betrayal was staggering. Tom stood up, his face pale. I can explain," he stammered, but Judge Williams cut him off. "You'll have your chance to speak," she said sharply. "But right now, you'll sit down and remain silent." Tom sank back into his seat, looking like he wanted to disappear. Marcus felt a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, but also a strange sense of relief. He'd known someone was trying to scare him, but he hadn't expected it to be Tom. The man who'd seemed so sympathetic, so willing to stand up to Karen, had been playing both sides all along. It was a twist no one had seen coming. Karen, meanwhile, looked like she'd been handed a lifeline. Her lawyer jumped to his feet, arguing that this new evidence proved Karen's innocence, that Tom had been acting on his own, trying to frame her. But Judge Williams wasn't buying it. "This doesn't absolve your client of her actions," she said firmly. "If anything, it shows a pattern of corruption and manipulation within the HOA." The closing arguments were tense. Marcus's lawyer laid out the case against Karen, emphasizing the abuse of power, the intimidation tactics, and the misuse of HOA funds. Karen's lawyer, on the other hand, tried to shift the blame onto Tom, painting Karen as a victim of his schemes. But it was clear that the tide had turned. The evidence against Karen was overwhelming, and no amount of spin could change that. Finally, Judge Williams delivered her verdict. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, "I find Karen guilty of multiple counts of harassment, intimidation, and misuse of HOA funds. Effective immediately, she is removed from her position as HOA president and barred from holding any leadership role in the future. Additionally, she is ordered to pay restitution to the affected homeowners and will face further legal consequences as determined by the appropriate authorities." The room erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Karen looked like she'd been hit by a truck, her face pale and her hands trembling. Marcus felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Because just as the gavel came down, Tom stood up again. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice shaking. "There's more. Karen wasn't acting alone. There's someone else, someone higher up, who's been pulling the strings this whole time." The room went silent. Even Judge Williams looked stunned. "Explain yourself," she said, her voice sharp. Tom took a deep breath. "Karen was just the face of it," he said. But the real power behind the HOA? It's the developer. They've been using the HOA to control the neighborhood, to drive out anyone who doesn't fit their vision. Karen was their puppet and I was their enforcer, but I'm done playing their games. The revelation was like a bombshell. The developer, the company that had built the neighborhood, had been manipulating things from the start. It was a twist no one had seen coming, and it changed everything. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about something much bigger. Judge Williams leaned forward, her expression grim. "This is a serious allegation," she said, "and it will be investigated thoroughly. But for now, this case is closed. Karen will face the consequences of her actions, and the HOA will be restructured to ensure this kind of abuse never happens again." As the hearing ended, Marcus stepped outside, feeling a mix of emotions. He'd won, but the victory felt bittersweet. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The developer was still out there, and who knew how deep their influence went, but for now he could breathe a little easier. Karen was gone, and the neighborhood had a chance to start fresh. And that's where we'll leave it. For now. Because, while this chapter might be over, the story is far from finished. The developer's role in all of this opens up a whole new can of worms, and the fight for justice is just beginning. But for today, Marcus can take a moment to celebrate. He stood up to Karen, exposed the corruption, and gave his neighborhood a chance at a better future. And sometimes that's enough. Stick around because this story, it's far from over. In the days following the hearing, the neighborhood felt like a different place. The weight of Karen's control had been lifted, but the revelation about the developer's involvement left everyone on edge. People gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones about what it all meant. For Marcus, it was a strange mix of relief and unease. He'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. Still, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He'd stood up to Karen, exposed her corruption, and given his neighbors a chance to reclaim their community. It was a start. The first order of business was restructuring the HOA. With Karen gone and Tom's betrayal exposed, the board was in shambles. But instead of letting the developer step in and appoint new members, the neighbors decided to take matters into their own hands. A town hall meeting was called, and for the first time in years, people showed up in droves. The room was packed, buzzing with energy and determination. Marcus stood at the front, flanked by Linda and a few other neighbors who'd been instrumental in bringing Karen down. Together, they laid out a plan for a new HOA, one that was transparent, fair, and accountable to the people it served. It wasn't easy. There were arguments, disagreements, and moments of doubt. But for the first time, everyone had a voice. People who'd been too afraid to speak up under Karen's rule now stood at the microphone, sharing their ideas and concerns. It was messy, but it was real. And by the end of the night, a new board had been elected, one that included Marcus, Linda, and a few other neighbors who'd proven they had the community's best interests at heart. It was a fresh start, and it felt like a victory, but the shadow of the developer still loomed large. Tom's revelation had sparked an investigation, and it wasn't long before the truth started to come out. The developer had been using the HOA as a tool to control the neighborhood, pushing out anyone who didn't fit their vision of a perfect community. They'd handpicked Karen, knowing she'd enforce their agenda with an iron fist, and when she started to lose control, they'd used Tom to try and silence Marcus. It was a web of manipulation and greed, and it went deeper than anyone had imagined. The investigation made headlines, and the developer was forced to answer for their actions. Fines were levied, lawsuits were filed, and the company's reputation was left in tatters. But for the neighborhood, the real victory was reclaiming their sense of community. Without the developer pulling the strings, people felt free to be themselves. Lawns didn't have to be perfectly manicured, mailboxes didn't have to match, and gardens could be as colorful as their owners wanted. It wasn't perfect. No neighborhood ever is. But it was real. And that was enough. For Marcus, the fight had taken its toll. He'd poured so much of himself into standing up to Karen and exposing the corruption that he hadn't stopped to think about what came next. But as he stood in his front yard one evening, watching the sun set over the rooftops, he felt a sense of peace. His house was still a work in progress. The shutters were still the wrong color and the mailbox was still a little crooked, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. Linda stopped by one day with a plate of cookies and a smile. "You did good, Marcus," she said, patting him on the shoulder. "We all did." Marcus smiled back, feeling a swell of gratitude. He hadn't done it alone. It had taken the courage of his neighbors, the determination of people like Linda, and the unwavering support of Judge Williams to bring Karen down and expose the developer's corruption. It was a reminder that change doesn't happen in isolation. It takes a community. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, holding regular meetings and keeping everyone informed. People started to get to know each other again, hosting block parties and potlucks that brought everyone together. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements and misunderstandings, but it was a far cry from the fear and division that had defined life under Karen's rule. Marcus found himself stepping into a new role, one he hadn't expected. People looked to him as a leader, someone who'd stood up for what was right and made a difference. It was a responsibility he didn't take lightly. He worked closely with the new HOA board, advocating for fairness and transparency, and making sure everyone's voice was heard. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. And then there was Karen. She disappeared from the neighborhood shortly after the hearing, her once imposing presence reduced to a memory. But her legacy lingered, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of standing up for what's right. Marcus didn't hate her. He pitied her. She'd been a pawn in the developer's game, just like everyone else. But in the end, she'd been held accountable for her actions, and that was what mattered. As for Tom, he'd cooperated fully with the investigation, hoping to lessen his own punishment. He'd been stripped of his position on the HOA board and faced legal consequences for his role in the intimidation tactics, but he'd also been given a chance to start over. Marcus didn't know if he could ever fully trust Tom again, but he believed in second chances. Everyone deserved the opportunity to make things right. The story of Marcus and Karen and the neighborhood that stood up to corruption spread far and wide. It became a symbol of what can happen when people come together to fight for what's right. It was a reminder that no one is above the law, and that even the smallest voices can make a difference. For Marcus, it was a lesson he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. And so, as the sun set on another day in the neighborhood, Marcus stood on his front porch, looking out at the houses and the people who made it a home. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that was enough. The fight was over, but the work of building a better community was just beginning. And Marcus knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. Because that's what neighbors do.